Hello folks, it's Paul Wilcock here from Mid-Cheshire Camera Club. Today we're going to talk about colour toning and how it enhances our images, or how we can use it to enhance our images. There's a bit to discuss today. We've got some examples of images that have been colour toned, and we're also going to show you some different methods of colour toning. In this video we're going to cover what colour toning is, how it affects our images, examples of how colour toning naturally appears in our work, examples of how we are naturally attracted to colour harmonies. We're also going to look at the Adobe colour wheel and how you can use it to decide on what colour harmonies you want, and how we apply colour harmonies to our images. So what tools within Photoshop or Lightroom do we have that will allow us to change the hues or the colour casts that we want to put into either the shadows or the highlights or the midtones. So without further ado, let's look at what it actually is. So I have here in Photoshop a number of images that are mine. These first three images are mine that I have worked on. Now, I've worked on these images at different times. So this was a 2018 image, this was a 2021 image, and this was a 2019/20 image. And these are the dates when I actually did the edits. So there's some significant time between editing these three images. Now, when you look at these images, on first inspection, I suppose, they don't look that similar. But when you actually drill down into the colours, and we're going to do that by looking at a grey layer with an luminosity blending mode, you can see that the predominant colours in this image of the band Jacklash Cat are blue, red and a yellowy orange. So there's three basic colours within that image. If we do the same with this image of the model Joshua, we've got the blue, we've got the red, and we've also got the orange, which is the same three colours. Maybe the shades are slightly different, but the amounts are different. So for argument's sake, there's less blue in this image than there is in this one. There's more blue on Joshua, far less red. There's only a little bit of red on his tie and on his lips, where red is the predominant colour here. And then in terms of the orange, there's a smattering of orange on his face, just like there is on the guitar here. If we look at the picture of Graham Curry and do the same with him, we also find that we have the orange, we have the red, but the blue is very subtle. Hopefully you can see it on your screen, but it's the blue is around in the band of the hat and in the shadows, and it also goes off to a bit of like a very faint purplish colour, like a mauve. We've got the blues coming down here in the shadows between his waistcoat. What I find absolutely really interesting is the fact that despite me editing these images over a 2 to 3 year period, how my natural instinct, my natural eye or artistic eye, is to draw these colours, these three basic colours together. And if I show you them together like this, you will see the colour similarities between all three images. And that's got to be more than coincidental. That's got to be how I like to edit my images. I naturally favour blues and reds and oranges, but I think it goes deeper than that. because if we apply these colours into what we call the Adobe colour wheel, we will find, and this is what this looks like, you'll find that these colours, which is the red, you've got the blues, and you've got the yellows or the oranges, form what we call a split complementary pattern or a split complementary harmony. So this is a screenshot of the colour wheel, and I'll show you the colour wheel in more detail in a moment. But in essence, you can plot your base colour, which I have done here. So that is plotted the red, and then you're able to, depending on what harmony you use, you're able to identify cooler colours and warmer colours that go with your base colour. And by doing that, if you use those colours in your image, you know that your colour harmonies are going to gel and they're going to be more pleasing to the eye, and that's what it's all about. Another example of this is if we look at Open Competition 3, we had 5 images from at least 5 top winning images from at least 3 different authors. Now, when you look at these images, yes, you've got the 2 wildlife images there are probably a similar colour palette, but you wouldn't have thought that the red squirrel is going to be on the same colour palette as the lions and the cheetahs, nor would you think that clergyman is on the same colour palette, or the ballet dancers. But when you do the grey layer with the blend mode of luminosity, you'll see that this wildlife image of the cheetahs is very much made up of greens, greeny yellow, orangey green, and then you've got this grey blue colour in the shadows. Let's look at the red squirrel. Very similar again, green and various different shades of green, orange, and then definitely the eye is made up of the blue, and the shadows the blue and the slightly mauvey colour. Look at the clergyman. Again, it's a different makeup. We've got a more predominant blue this time. Have got some green, but it's less. But the overall colour, the dominating colour, is the orange. And this is indicative of, all of these images really, is that although they're sharing the same colour harmony, the dominating colour changes. So here we have the background here with that yellowy green. We do have the orange on the skin tones, and yet the dresses, bearing in mind the dresses were black and white, they've got this greyish blue tinge to it, more so on the white dress than the black dress, but there's definitely a greyish blue tinge. That colour there is very much different to the grey strip down the bottom. And the last image out of the 5, no surprises there. You've got a predominantly yellowy green background. The lions of this are the same orange colour that's been repeating throughout this series, and then we've got the cooler bluey grey tones in the shadows. And then when we look at the images together, you can see that there is definite pattern that has been made up from all these images within the colour tones. And for one judge to choose that all these images from 50 odd images as the winning 5, this has got to be more than a coincidence. It's got to be more than a coincidence. And I'll be honest with you, I can't remember who the judge was, but that judge, from my point of view, is someone who is attracted to this particular colour harmony. If we take this colour make up this colour harmony to the Adobe colour wheel, we find that what we have here is a triad. So before we were looking at, with my stuff, we're looking at split complementary harmony. These colours here are more of a triadic colour harmony. So where depending on your base colour, and I've set it actually as the base colour is orange, you've got green going into brown and this mauve colour going into more of a purple colour, and the shadows. And when I was talking about the shadows, I'm saying that the shadows are represented by this bluey grey colour, which is like this mauve colour here. From my point of view, that's more than coincidental. And to sort of further the point a little bit, this was this image of Joshua and that image of the seagull taken by Ian. These were two images that came in as highly commended. And if you look at the colour harmony used for both of these images, it's more back to that split complementary colour harmony that I prefer. I actually took this image of Joshua, and there's no one more surprised than me that this colour harmony is very similar to the colour harmonies that I've already shown you within my work. The colour harmony for Ian Seagull is also very similar to the Joshua one. Well, what does that mean? It means that the judge subconsciously recognised, and this is my personal view, but the judge subconsciously recognised the colour harmonies in these two images and didn't like them as much. Okay, let's talk about how we change colours. You are able to actually change the hues or the colours of subjects using things like hue saturation layers. That goes beyond the scope of this video. What I'm going to show you is 4 different ways of adding a colour overlay or a colour cast or a colour tone, either globally or to the shadows or to the midtones or to the highlights. By doing that, you will add what we call colour contrast. It'll make the image punchier and it'll give the image drama and hopefully help to tell the story that you're trying to tell within the image. So we've got this photograph here of Chinese New Year taken by me a few years ago in Chester. I've done some very basic edits to start off with, just to get as a decent base for colour grading. If I go to my grey layer and turn that on, you can see the primary colours that we have. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole process of plotting these colours into the colour wheel because to keep this video relatively short, we're going to work on complementary colours, which are 2 colours opposite each other on the colour wheel. And looking at this image, I'm proposing that we have yellowish orange highlights and then bluey stroke tealy green shadows. They're the two groups of colours that stand out to me from this image from looking at this particular view. Our first example of colour grading is a colour balance adjustment layer, and you can find that by going to the adjustment layer icon down the bottom here, which is the half circle, and going all the way up to colour balance. Clicking on that, you'll be faced with this dialog box. So we have the coloured balance layer and we've got some shadows here, and what I want to do is I want to create a tealy blue or tealy green colour within the shadows. So if I turn to shadows here, drop from the top, the tone drop down, and I push it out, push the slider, the top slider towards the cyan, you can see it already going a bit like that, a bit tealy green. If I then push the middle slider towards the greens, you don't need to do a lot, it's quite powerful. You can see that all of a sudden all the shadows are turning a cooler tone. Now, in essence, that's our shadows colour toned. If we drop it down to the highlights, we want to make them a bit warmer. So orange is made up of yellow and a bit of red. So all of a sudden now, we can just throw in a tad of magenta, a smidge of magenta. So all of a sudden now, you've got an image that was looking a little bit flat, but now is a bit punchy. Now what we can do is reduce the opacity on the layer just to take some of the edge off that, and you can do that to suit. So that's where it was before the adjustments, and as I increase the opacity, it feels right around about here. Now what you could do in this sense is add a second colour balance layer. If I duplicate that, and if I reset both of these, turn that top one off. So this one could be for shadows, and this one could be for highlights. So if we're looking at this one first, I'm only interested in the shadows, and we want them to be cooler, and we want something like that. And because we've got opacity on a separate layer now, or what we've done is we've split our shadows and highlights. When I move the opacity, I'm only going to be affecting the shadows. So I can afford to be a little bit heavier handed with my sliders. So when I move the opacity now, where it's that's 100%, it's too much, but I can really squeeze that down now. I'm only affecting what I've put into the shadows, and I'm only looking at those dark colours. I have masked out the sky, because what was happening was the sky was blowing out a little bit. So but that for me looking pretty good, and I can turn that layer on, turn it off, and you can see the effect it's had. Now if I switch this other layer back on now, the highlights layer, and go to the highlights, I can stick in a bit of red. Oh, fancy a bit of that. I stick in a bit of yellow, and all of a sudden now it's lifting it, it's changing it. We've got contrast between the shadows and the highlights. And if I take that on and off, hopefully you can see the difference. And if it's at 61%, but 100% is too much. But as I slide it down, you will find your happy medium where it looks, using your eye, and it looks probably all right, actually about 60%. So when I switch off that layer, switch it back on again, hopefully you can recognize we've got color contrast, and it's quite powerful. So that's your first option. The next option you have is using color lookup tables. So if you click on the adjustment layer icon and select color lookup, you'll get that dialog box. We're only interested in dropping down the top very most drop down arrow, and these are all the different lookup tables that you can play around with. The colour generally is written into the title, but we're looking for horror blue, as our first one, and as you can see, that is sent everything massively blue. Okay, now we would usually tone down the blue to around the 15 to the 30% more mark to find that happy medium for yourself. Now you can see that effect taking place. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. Now at the moment, that blue is affecting everything on this image, and we only want it to affect the shadows. So the way we can do that is by using this mask. Now what you need to do first is delete this mask. Alright, then you need to go up to your channels layer, or your channels tab, which is next to your layers tab, and whilst holding down your control key, I'm not sure what it is on a Mac, click on the RGB channel, and you'll notice that everything, or should I say, you'll notice that all the highlights on your image have been selected. If you go back to the layers tab, select your adjustment layer, which should already be selected, and then click on the mask icon at the bottom here, it then gives you a mask, but it's a gradient mask, and it's selecting the highlights and then everything between the highlights to the shadows. So although it looks like a black and white image, it's not, it's a gradient mask. So anything that's black is hiding the effect of the lookup table, and anything that's white is revealing it. Now that is the wrong way around, because we want the blue not in the highlights, we want the blue in the shadows. So the way we get around that is by inverting that mask. We do that by pressing control, highlighting the mask, as you can see it's got the white box around it, and pressing Control I, and you'll see the mask now looks strange. It's inverted, but it means that where there's white on the mask, it's allowing that blue colour, this horror blue colour, to come through, and where the black is, it's hiding it or concealing it. Simple as that. So now if we go back to our adjustment layer, as we ramp up the opacity, the effect is only taking place in the blacks and the shadows within the image. The highlights and the whites are not being affected. Now if I duplicate that layer for ease, and I click on the adjustment icon here, the lookup table, and I change this now to something like edgy amber. Let me just take that mask off. Edgy amber on 100% looks not very good. It doesn't look very good, but it's a great colour for giving crisp warmth when it's used in the right place. At the moment though, the edgy amber is taking effect in the same place as the shadows, and that's not what we want. So we need to turn that mask around using Control I again. So now the edgy amber is affecting just the highlights and the whites, but it's still too much, so we need to reduce it considerably, and somewhere around 20% is quite good. It is giving some warmth. So we've got our colour in the highlights, and we've got our tone in there, and we've got our tone in the shadows. Now if you wish, you can add more. So for argument's sake, and I always add a minimum of 3, but if we duplicate that layer again, and rather than going for horror blue, we go for tension green. At the moment it's set for 84%, and we've got to make sure that the mask is the same, and they are. So now you can play around with your opacity and build up your own recipe of LUTs. I've used this very successfully with a number of images that came first and third for me. I had two firsts and a third, and they were images of people running through the bog at Delamere Forest, where doing the Hell Runner for the Northwest. And you know, it's a dirty, dark, dank place, and just by using a couple of LUTs to help tell that story, you know, the images did really well. So we've got two now in the shadows. If you wanted to do so, you could put in the colours. So that's Horror Blue. This is Tension Green. Just so you know what recipe you've used. This is Edgy Amber. And you might want to think, well, you know, let's throw another one. Let's throw a candlelight or something, because that's what. Oh, you're going to love this. Let's throw in Foggy Night. Foggy Night is like using a bit of a neutral density filter. There we go. Foggy Night. Now, what this does, it calms everything down. It takes some of the punch out of it when it's too high. Take that down to about 10% or something like that. Maybe a little bit higher, 15%. Yeah, it's really subtle, but it just helps to add that contrast. So when you turn that group off, that's the original, and that's using LUTs. Now, depending on how much opacity you want to use, depending on the colour recipe that you use, you can build up some really unique colour grading options to your image. And you know, at the end of the day, your imagination is your only barrier to how you want to colour things. And as you can see from that drop down list, there's all sorts of colours or lookup tables to use. So the next one is gradients, and there's two types. There's a gradient and the gradient map. The first one we're going to use is gradient. So when you click that first, you'll get this type of dialog box, and you've got all sorts of you know, different types of adjustment that you can play around with. Doesn't really look much at the moment, but you've got the linear, which is a line, and you can play around with how that linear line affects your image, or you can have the angle, or the radial, or the reflected, or the diamond. The diamond is pretty good as well. And then depending on your scale will affect the size of the diamond or the radial in your image. But you're thinking, well, that doesn't look very colourful to me. I get that. So if you click on the gradient colour bar and you go to the gradient type and change that from solid to noise, it automatically changes to a colour. If you change the roughness to around 15%, it smooths out all those lines. If it goes up to 100%, you can see it looks like a bag of sick. But if you take it down to about 15-20%, you will see all the different colours within the gradient coming through. Now at the moment it's showing you a diamond shape, and that's because we've got it set to diamond. But if it was linear, for argument's sake, and we did the same for linear, so back to noise. Now the linear is going down top to bottom. That's because we've got the angle set top to bottom. But if I change the angle back to that sort of 90 degrees, there we go. Click on the bar again, click to noise. Now we've got the linear lines going going left to right. So let's move the roughness down to about 15% to start off with. That'll do us. Leave the restrict colours, tick the box, and put in add transparency in the other tick box. Now, all of a sudden now you have got a colorized image. But the beauty about this is that all you need to do is click this randomise button. Look at that. It is randomising, and if you want it to slightly, if you go a little bit too much to the 50, you'll start to see the bands. But you can always get rid of that by reducing your opacity. But you just keep clicking randomise, you'll see all these fantastic colours coming through. And then what you do is you choose one that you like. So let's say we like that. We click OK. Now, we've got to click OK again. Let's reduce the opacity to something a bit more natural. Yeah. Don't forget, we've also got blend modes. We stick a soft light blend mode in there, or an overlay blend mode. Soft light's looking good. What about linear light? Linear light's bringing that colour through lovely. Let's go, hard light's not bad. Doesn't really work, doesn't work so badly at all actually with multiply. And screen, it makes it a little bit flat with screen. Let's stick with the soft light. So we double click on the icon in the layers panel, click on the gradient colour bar, and just continue to press randomise. Now you've got to do this relatively slowly because you might find one that you like, and the nature of the way Photoshop is set up, you can only go back so many times before that stops working using Ctrl Z. So that's not bad at all. So if I click OK on that. Now that's a global adjustment. I could do something similar to what I did with the LUTs and have one just specifically for the shadows, have one for the highlights, and if you wanted to do so. But I'm going to leave that as it is, but I'm going to bring in the next gradient, which is a gradient map, and utilize these together. So as a gradient map, clicking on the color bar of the gradient map reveals this box, and if I change solid back to noise and 50% down to 25%, I'm going to OK on that. I'm going to reduce the colours or reduce the opacity, and then change the blend mode back to overlay. Oh, sorry, soft light. Now you get a different effect because it's basically applying that colour effect in relation to the gradient map of the image. So that gives it again a unique feel. Now you can click on the colour bar and then click randomise until you find something that you like. And this is working quite nicely with the bottom gradient one as well. So we've got some nice purples into going through violets into some cyans with that one, and that's giving quite a nice effect, so I'm going to leave it there. So if I take the effect off, that's the before and that's the after. It's quite subtle, but it's also quite pleasing. and it's really quite addictive in terms of playing around with it, just clicking through that randomise button. I'll leave you with that one to have a play with. So our last option is using Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. This is quite simple in how we're going to use this. So if I just open up Adobe Camera Raw now, we're pretty much going to do this by eye. We're going straight to the colour grading tool, which has now replaced split toning. The only difference really is the fact that it's now represented in 3 circles as opposed to 2 bars, and the third circle is mid-tones, which is not in the older versions of Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So we now can alter shadows, highlights and mid-tones. So if you wanted to do so, you could do a triadic colour grading process, as well as a complementary one. Complementary would just affect the shadows and highlights, where the triadic would affect all 3. So by way of an example, if we did a very quick triadic colour grading exercise, if you think that in every circle or in the colour wheel there's 360 degrees, if we start off with our highlights at 0 and we put the hue at 0, that gives us a nice warm red colour, and then it's down to us, personal preference, as to how much saturation you use. So we give a sort of a mid-level saturation, about 36, and I'm keeping the brightness quite down because it will affect the sky and it might blow that sky out. So the luminance is quite low. So the next one is going to be the shadows. I've set the shadows to 120 because if you divide 3 into 360, it is 120. So there's going to be 120 degrees difference between all 3 of these, and that gives us a cool green. Okay, depending on how much green you want, you can alter the saturation and also the luminance. Now I'm keeping the luminance quite down because it's giving a bit more contrast, and I'm looking now at the mid-tones. It's giving a blue in the mid-tones at 240. Now if I wanted to do, I could swap the mid-tones for the shadows. So for argument's sake, I could put 240 on the shadows and make the mid-tones green at 120. It's still within a triadic colour harmony, but what it allows us to do is to get some darker colours into those shadows. If I just up the saturation, yeah, that's looking a lot better. And then the mid-tones then are going to complement the shadows. So this is, so that's at 120, that's too much green, it's not bad. We can lower the luminance down a little bit as well, but I'm quite happy with that. Yes, so that's given us quite a nice little bit of punch now. If we look at the global view now, where all 3 are together, you'll see that we've got equidistant points between our highlights, our midtones and our shadows. So we've got a good colour grading process in place. And that's a good example of triadic colour grading. Okay, if we wanted to do complementary colour grading, we're just going to be looking at shadows and highlights. So what we would need to do is select the midtones and reduce the saturation down to 0. Go to our highlights, select an appropriate colour, We're looking at, let's just up the saturation so we can see what we're doing. We're looking at an orangey yellow. Doesn't have to be orangey yellow, we could go magenta-ish. But as for the reason we talked about before, orangey yellow looks good. So we'll call that 40. We know that there's 360 degrees in a circle. So if we divide that by 2, it's 180. So I've picked a hue with a value of 40, and if I add 180 to it, it gives me an opposite number of 220. So in the shadows, I need to dial in 220. And if I look at the global image now, you can see that that shadow blue is at the opposite end of the wheel to where the orange is in the highlights. Now I have these sliders at the bottom which will help me blend the two together and also balance the two, so I can balance in favour of the highlights or balance in favour of the shadows depending on what I want. And in fairness, I think it does look better balanced in favour of the shadows. So when I turn that off, that's before, that's after. It gives us some nice colour contrast and a bit of punch, and that's what we're after. We can OK on that. So we're now back in Photoshop, and we have the ability to use opacity to do some fine adjustments on our adjustment there, on our colour grading. And if we wanted to do, we can add a mask, and we can start blocking out with a brush aspects of the colour grading where we didn't want it to be. You are limited in Lightroom, you can't add masks in Lightroom. You can just do the colour grading and that's it. It's more primitive. There's a little bit more finesse in the Photoshop. So just to recap now, we've talked a little bit about how to identify your colours in your image by adding this grey layer, and then taking your colours through to the Adobe colour wheel to understand where your colours lie within various colour harmonies on that colour wheel. We've talked about how to use colour balance adjustment layers to affect your image in the highlights or the midtones if you wanted to use the midtones, and also the shadows. We've talked about adding lookup tables, LUTs, to create a recipe to grade your image in a certain way. We've also talked about utilising gradients and using that Randomise tool to build gradients on a normal gradient layer, and then more latterly using the gradient map. We've talked about how to add gradient masks by using the RGB channel to identify all the highlights, to select all the highlights, and then utilising that within our masks so we can just mask out either the highlighted tones or the shadow tones to assist in our colour grading. And then lastly, we've talked about using the colour grading tools within Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom to do some basic triadic and complementary colour grading. Hopefully you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing your images colour graded in future competitions. Thank you.